In the spring of 1962, a 12-man A-team from the United States Army Special Forces arrived at a village called Buon Enau in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. The village belonged to the Raid, one of dozens of indigenous tribal peoples who had lived in the mountains of Southeast Asia for thousands of years before Vietnam existed as a nation. The Special Forces soldiers brought medicine, food, and weapons. They also brought a proposition. "Fight with us," they said, "and we will protect you." The Raid elders agreed. Within a year, Buon Enau had become a fortified village with trained fighters capable of defending themselves and conducting offensive operations against the Viet Cong. Within 2 years, the program had spread to dozens of villages across the Central Highlands, encompassing thousands of fighters from more than a dozen different tribal groups. The Americans called the program the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, or CIDG. The Vietnamese called the mountain people Moi, a word that meant savage. The French had called them Montagnards, which meant simply mountain people. The Green Berets who lived with them, trained them, fought alongside them, and in many cases formed bonds with them that lasted the rest of their lives, called them by a name that carried the weight of genuine respect. They called them the Yards. What followed over the next 13 years was a story of extraordinary military partnership, of courage and sacrifice on a scale that has never been adequately documented, and of a betrayal so complete that its consequences are still being felt today, in the jungles of Vietnam, in the refugee camps of Cambodia, and in the living rooms of apartment complexes in Raleigh, North Carolina, where elderly Montagnard men sit and talk about the mountains they will never see again. To understand the Montagnards, you have to understand that they were not Vietnamese. This is not a minor distinction. The Vietnamese, both North and South, regarded the Highland tribes with a contempt that had deep historical roots. For centuries, the lowland Vietnamese had pushed the Highland peoples further and further into the mountains, taking their agricultural land, disrupting their trade, and treating them as a subordinate and inferior population. The Montagnards were ethnically, linguistically, and culturally distinct from the Vietnamese in almost every meaningful way. They spoke their own languages, practiced their own religions, organized their societies according to their own traditions, and had their own political aspirations that had nothing to do with the Vietnamese Civil War being fought below them in the lowlands. When the Americans arrived, the Montagnards saw an opportunity, not because they were naturally inclined toward the United States, but because the Americans were offering something that neither the North Vietnamese nor the South Vietnamese government had ever offered: recognition, weapons, and a degree of autonomy. The Special Forces A-teams that moved into the Highlands operated very differently from conventional military units. They learned the local languages, they participated in village ceremonies, they ate the food, drank the rice wine, accepted the brass bracelets that the tribes gave to people they considered allies and brothers. They treated the Montagnards as partners rather than as instruments. In return, the Montagnards gave them something that American military planners had not fully anticipated. They gave them everything. The CIDG program at its peak enrolled approximately 42,000 Montagnard fighters, organized into Civilian Irregular Defense Group companies and mobile strike force units known as Mike forces. These men knew the terrain of the Central Highlands the way their ancestors had known it for generations. They could move through triple canopy jungle at night without light, read signs of human passage that American soldiers trained for months to detect, and sustain themselves in the field on resources that would have left conventional units starving within days. They were not just effective fighters, they were, in the specific conditions of the Vietnam War's Highland theater, irreplaceable. The intelligence value alone was enormous. Montagnard scouts and trackers provided American Special Forces with a picture of North Vietnamese Army movements through the highlands and along the Ho Chi Minh Trail's western branches that no satellite, no signals intercept, and no aerial reconnaissance could have matched. They knew which trails the NVA used in which season, where the water sources were, which valleys were being used as staging areas. They had been watching these mountains for generations. The NVA could not hide from them the way they could hide from Americans. The combat record was equally remarkable. Montagnard units participated in some of the most significant Special Forces operations of the war, including the defense of the Special Forces camp at Plei Mai in 1965, which was a direct precursor to the Battle of Ia Drang, the first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese regular forces. At Plei Mai, a besieged Special Forces camp held by Montagnard CIDG fighters bought the time that allowed American conventional forces to respond. The Montagnards held their positions under sustained NVA assault for days, suffering significant casualties, and did not break. They held other camps too in circumstances that were equally desperate. The Special Forces camp at Dak Tu, at Dak Siang, at Ben Het, at dozens of other isolated outposts in the highlands that were the front lines of a war that most Americans never saw because it was happening in mountains that had no roads and no journalists. At each of these places, Montagnard fighters stood and fought alongside their Green Beret advisors against an enemy that significantly outnumbered them. The casualty rates in these units were, by any measure, extraordinary. Precise figures for total Montagnard casualties during the Vietnam War are difficult to establish because the South Vietnamese government, which regarded the Montagnards with contempt and kept them out of its official military structure as much as possible, did not maintain careful records of indigenous casualties. Estimates by researchers and by Montagnard advocacy organizations suggest that somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 Montagnards died during the war years, from combat, from bombing, from disease, from displacement, and from the deliberate destruction of their villages by both sides. In a pre-war population of approximately 1 million, those numbers represent a demographic catastrophe. The relationship between the Montagnards and the South Vietnamese government was, from the beginning, deeply hostile. The government in Saigon viewed the CIDG program with suspicion, partly because it armed people they considered savages, and partly because they correctly perceived that the Special Forces were fostering a degree of Montagnard political consciousness and organizational capacity that made the tribes harder to control. As early as 1964, Montagnard leaders had begun articulating aspirations for autonomy in the highlands, for a political arrangement that would give them control over their own lands and governance. In September 1964, several CIDG camps launched a coordinated uprising against South Vietnamese Special Forces troops, killing a number of Vietnamese and taking others hostage. American Special Forces officers, who had close personal relationships with the Montagnard leaders involved, negotiated the end of the uprising and secured the release of the hostages. The political tensions that had caused it were never resolved. The American military's response to these tensions was essentially to manage them rather than address them. The CIDG program was too valuable to abandon, but American commanders were not willing to confront the South Vietnamese government on behalf of Montagnard political rights. The tribal leaders were told, repeatedly and in various forms, that their political aspirations would be addressed after the war was won. In the meantime, they should continue fighting. The Montagnards continued fighting. The political aspirations were never addressed. As the war escalated and American conventional forces poured into Vietnam after 1965, the strategic importance of the Central Highlands became increasingly clear. The highlands controlled access to the coastal lowlands from the west. If North Vietnamese forces could move through the highlands in strength, they could cut South Vietnam in half. Defending the highlands became a major American military priority, which meant the CIDG program and the Montagnard fighters became even more critical. The Special Forces camps in the highlands were, in a very real military sense, the plugs in the dam, and the Montagnards were the ones holding the plugs. The American commanders who relied on Montagnard fighters understood their value. At the individual level, the Special Forces soldiers who served alongside them understood it even more viscerally. There are accounts from Green Berets who served multiple tours specifically because they could not bring themselves to leave the people they had come to regard as brothers. Men who extended their deployments, who waived their rotation dates, who went back again and again to the same camps, the same villages, the same valleys, because leaving felt like abandonment. Some of them were right about what that feeling meant. The beginning of the end for the Montagnards came not in 1975 but earlier, with the gradual transfer of CIDG program responsibilities from American Special Forces to the South Vietnamese military in 1970 and 1971, a process the Americans called Vietnamization. The theory was that the South Vietnamese military could absorb the CIDG structure and continue operating it effectively. The reality was that the South Vietnamese military had no interest in treating Montagnard fighters as equals and no capacity for the kind of relationship-based trust that had made the program work. Montagnard units that had fought effectively under American advisors began to deteriorate as soon as Vietnamese commanders took over. The cultural contempt was immediate and corrosive. When the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973 and American forces began their final withdrawal, the Montagnards were not consulted. They had no seat at any table where their fate was being decided. The political autonomy they had been promised in exchange for a decade of fighting and hundreds of thousands of casualties was not mentioned in the accords. The highlands they had defended, the camps they had held, the trails they had watched, none of it was addressed in any document that gave them any protection or recognition. The fall came in the spring of 1975, as North Vietnamese forces swept south with a speed that surprised even optimistic American analysts. The Central Highlands collapsed early. The South Vietnamese military, demoralized and undersupplied, began retreating from the highlands in March 1975. The retreat became a rout. On National Route 7B, a secondary road through the mountains, a column of retreating soldiers and civilians became trapped and was destroyed. Thousands died on that road. Montagnard families who had fought for 10 years alongside the Americans were caught in the chaos, trying to flee with children and elderly relatives through mountains that were now being overrun. The Americans who had promised to protect them were gone. The last American combat forces had left in 1973. The CIA officers who had worked with Montagnard leaders were being evacuated from Saigon. There were no helicopters coming to the highlands. There was no plan, no extraction protocol, no contingency for the people who had made the American war in the highlands possible. They were left to face what was coming alone. What came was systematic and deliberate. The new communist government viewed the Montagnards, with their long history of fighting alongside Americans and their aspirations for autonomy, as a triple threat. They were potential counter-revolutionaries. They occupied land that the government wanted to redistribute to lowland Vietnamese settlers, and they represented a model of indigenous political organization that challenged the authority of the central state. The response was comprehensive repression. Montagnard leaders were arrested. Villages were forcibly relocated to lowland areas where the tribes could be more easily monitored and controlled. The highland forests that had been Montagnard homeland for generations were designated for logging and agricultural development and cleared. Traditional religious practices were suppressed. Armed resistance continued. Small groups of Montagnard fighters, some of them veterans of the CIDG program, continued fighting in the highlands for years after 1975, with no outside support, no supplies, and no hope of rescue. The organization known as FULRO, the Front Unifié de Lutte des Races Opprimées, which had been the political voice of Montagnard aspirations since the 1960s, maintained a guerrilla presence in the highlands until 1992, when the last 300 fighters surrendered to United Nations peacekeepers in Cambodia. They had been fighting without any outside support for 17 years after the war ended. They walked out of the jungle carrying weapons and a flag, and they asked to be taken somewhere safe. They were resettled in the United States. The Montagnard community in the United States today numbers approximately 7,000 people, concentrated primarily in Greensboro and Raleigh, North Carolina. They came in waves, some as refugees in the late 1970s and 1980s, some through subsequent refugee programs, some through the efforts of Vietnam veterans who had served with them and spent decades working to bring them to safety. The veterans who advocated for them did so largely without government support, writing letters, making phone calls, navigating immigration bureaucracies, doing the work that the government that had employed Montagnard fighters for a decade showed no interest in doing. In the highlands of Vietnam, the situation for remaining Montagnard communities has remained difficult. Human Rights Watch has documented repeated cycles of repression, particularly following protests in 2001 and 2004, when Montagnard communities demonstrated for religious freedom and land rights. Protesters were imprisoned. Churches were demolished. Families who attempted to flee to Cambodia to seek asylum were forcibly returned. The land that the tribes had farmed for generations has been progressively taken over by lowland Vietnamese settlers and state-owned enterprises. The forests where Montagnard hunters had moved for thousands of years have been cleared. The American government has never formally acknowledged the debt it owes to the Montagnard people. There has been no official apology, no reparations program, no serious governmental effort to address the situation of Montagnard communities still living under repression in Vietnam. The veterans who served alongside the Yards, who accepted their bracelets and drank their rice wine and fought beside them in the mountains, are old men now. They have not forgotten, they have not stopped trying, but they are running out of time, and the government they served has shown no sign of sharing their sense of obligation. The raid elders who met that 12-man Special Forces team at Buon Anao in 1962 made a decision that they believed was a partnership. They gave their fighters, their intelligence, their knowledge of the mountains, and ultimately their sons. In exchange, they were promised protection. The promise was not kept. The mountains are still there. The people who knew them best were driven out, and the Americans who benefited most from their sacrifice have, with very few exceptions, moved on. There is a video on screen right now that goes deeper into the forgotten allies of the Vietnam War, and if this story left you with something you can't easily put down, subscribe. Some debts don't disappear just because no one talks about them anymore.